Hi friends, I'm Doug Pratt, and I'm inviting you to join me in a fascinating adventure as we journey through the New Testament. It is the greatest book that's ever been written, the most influential. Thousands, millions of other books and artworks and songs have been inspired by it. It is a book like none other that has impacted and shaped our entire world culture. The New Testament is the final portion bound together with what is called the Old Testament in our Bibles. The New Testament is much shorter. It was written much closer to our own time. It is much more compact in its message. The New Testament is a fascinating book. Of course, the New Testament is built upon the foundation of the Old, just as a house is built upon its footers and its foundation. But the New Testament is where the message, consistent completely with the Old Testament, is fulfilled and driven home and applied to life in an incredible way. We are inviting you to take this journey through the New Testament and allow it to become real to you as we walk through it. I am convinced that no one can claim to be a well-educated and well-read individual in the Western world if they have not read the New Testament. It is that foundational. I know there are some people who have dismissed Christianity and have never read the New Testament. In my mind, that is intellectually lazy, even dishonest and timid. For to dismiss the basic teachings without encountering them is a sign of cowardice. And therefore, I invite everybody to engage for themselves with this book that has had such a powerful impact. And we're going to be doing it together and inviting you to go along on this journey. Each of these months, we will be, as the pastoral staff of First Church of Bonita Springs, giving you a brief orientation and introduction to the reading we will experience that month. Now, first, I'm going to share with you a bit of an introduction to the Gospel of Matthew, the very first of the books of the New Testament, which we will be reading in the sequence where they are printed. And to understand Matthew, we need to see it in the context of the four Gospels. They are the biographies that occupy the first portion of the New Testament, four different looks at the same individual, all of them telling us about this remarkable person. To have four books that each from a slightly different angle and yet completely unified and consistent in the basic story and the basic message, these books capture for us all the dimensions of one man whose name was Yeshua ben Yosef, Joshua, son of Joseph, or fully anglicized, Jesus, Joseph's son, or son of Joseph. This man, Jesus, is captured in the four Gospels. Now, the Gospels were a new literary form for the world. We call them biographies, though they're not exactly in the format that you would typically find in a modern 21st century biography of a famous individual. But they were very different than the stories about famous people that were written in the ancient world. Almost all of them about kings and queens and generals and emperors, or in a mythological, fictional way, about imaginary gods and goddesses and their interaction with mortals. But every single one of those stories is a whitewash or a depiction of the person without the real flesh and blood complexity that we find in the Gospels. The Gospels are amazingly honest and comprehensive, whereas these other ancient stories tell about the virtues and the so-called heroic deeds of their subject, oftentimes emphasizing the virtues that the Old Testament or the ancient world valued as great examples of powerful people, but would not exactly be considered Christian virtues by any means. Violence and pride and quest for power and lust and acquisition of wealth. These were the values that the ancient world held up. Those are not the values we find in the Gospels at all. What is unique about the Gospels is that they are 4 biographies written about a person who was not royal, a person from a working class community on the eastern fringe of the great Roman Empire, a man who never owned any property, held an office, commanded an army, or even wrote a book, a man who never traveled more than 150 miles from his birthplace, and yet a man whose life was unlike any other. No one described in world literature, nonfiction or fiction, has ever been like this man, Jesus. No one you've ever met or interacted with is anything like this man. He is sui generis. He is his own breed. There is never a person anywhere else who is quite like him. The other Gospels, the other characters in the Gospels, rather, the people that you find, the apostles, the Pharisees, those who interact with Jesus, they are all normal people. We can relate to all of them. They have their strengths and their flaws. The Gospels are very honest, even in describing people who went on to be leaders of the early church. No whitewashing there. But it is Jesus' character that stands out so supremely and unlike any other. The whole rest of the New Testament is all about understanding that one man and his life and his impact. The book of Acts, which immediately follows the 4 Gospels, is the history of the first generation of the followers of Jesus. And following that, we have 21 letters written by the followers of Christ explaining what he did and how to live in a new way because of him. And then the final book, the book of Revelation, a prophecy of the future impacted by Christ's coming and what he did in this world. So all of the New Testament focuses around this one man, and it's all encompassed in a very short time span. We find that the entire New Testament was written within about 30 to 40 years of the life of Christ, and it captures the events in a very tight timetable. Now, some critics of the Christian faith have argued that because the biographies of Jesus were not written contemporaneously with his life, therefore they must be made up and invented stories. On the contrary, I would argue that biographies written within that short a time of the person's life must be accurate. If, for example, I were to write a biography of Ronald Reagan, whose presidency ended just a little more than 30 years ago, and were to make up fanciful stories and invent speculative and untrue events, these would be disproven because there are still alive today people who were there and who witnessed them. In the same way, if the Gospels were really just made up fairy tales, and yet were written so soon after the events, those who were there, the eyewitnesses, would have immediately disproven them, refuted them, and they would have never made it to our times. That's a strong argument for the validity and the reliability of the New Testament. Another argument is because the documents were produced out of a tradition called an oral tradition, where people were trained in a time, remember, before the invention of the printing press, when professionals were skilled at being able to memorize and repeat and pass on accurately facts and speeches and teachings, in addition to the validity of the oral tradition. Almost all of those who wrote the New Testament were in some way eyewitnesses. In fact, 2 of the 4 gospel writers, Matthew and John, were right there for all the action. And Mark, we're pretty confident, based upon accurate and reliable tradition, wrote down and recorded the reflections and memories of the Apostle Peter, who was there for all the action. And then there was Luke, who was a skillful historian, and who we find in his 2nd volume, Luke wrote the book Luke, and also volume 2, Acts, the Acts of the Apostles. Luke was so accurate as a historian that his reliability continues to be confirmed by archaeology. Therefore, we are confident that what we have in the Gospels is of historic trustworthiness. And therefore, what they tell us about this man Jesus is true to who he really was and what he did. With that as a background of the 4 Gospels, let me zero in on the book of Matthew. Now, actually, Matthew, as the first of the 3 known as synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic literally means look alike. And the first 3 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke do follow a very similar pattern, whereas the Gospel of John, which we believe was the last of the 4 to be written, and was intended by an eyewitness to fill in the gaps not covered and not touched by the first 3 look-alike Gospels. John is very different, but it is supplementary and does not in any way refute Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So, Matthew is the first of the synoptic Gospels. Matthew took advantage of other material, as well as his own notes and reflections, to produce a consistent order of the life of Christ. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the author and then a little bit about his times, because it's helpful to know that. The author was not only known as Matthew, but also had a second name that he went by, Levi. We're not sure if that was a middle name or if it was a nickname, but he was commonly referred to by both of those names. He was an educated Jew. We assume he grew up in a God-fearing, Orthodox Jewish home. He certainly knew his Old Testament Bible. But by the time he encountered Jesus Christ, he had strayed very far, at least in practice, from his Orthodox spiritual roots. For he had become a tax collector, working in collaboration with the occupying Roman army. I'll tell you a little bit more about Rome in just a moment. But Matthew's profession, which was very lucrative, one of the best ways to become rich in ancient first century Judea and Galilee, Matthew was a social outcast by the respectable people because of his collaboration with the Romans. And then came his conversion, a dramatic, unexpected conversion that Matthew himself records, and its ripple effect, shockwaves, led him to a total career change. Keep in mind that as Matthew writes the biography of this man whom he spent years with and knew up close and personal so intimately, this is not a dispassionate, objective observer. Matthew's personal life has been transformed by an encounter and a relationship with Christ, and thus he's biased in that respect. Though if indeed Jesus is who Matthew portrays him to be, how could you not be transformed and impacted by time with him? So that's a little bit about who Matthew was. Now, we need to understand the times of the New Testament. Just as it would be impossible to make sense if you suddenly landed in America from another country, had never been here, and knew nothing about the United States of America. If you arrived in New York City and picked up a Wall Street Journal, you would not understand a lot of it, because you need to understand the political and social and economic context in the same way it is essential, if someone's going to open the pages of the New Testament, that they understand at least something of what was happening. So here's the background. The Jews, inhabitants of 2 provinces, Galilee in the north and Judea in the south, have been governed by a couple generations now by an occupying army of the Roman Empire, the worldwide superpower. Rome's typical way of administering its captive provinces was not to insert all of its own people in every role, but rather to take advantage of and co-opt the people of that country and lead them to become collaborators. In the same way, when the Nazis occupied France in 1940, They did not install a complete government, but rather utilized a collaborating government of Frenchmen known as the Vichy government. The same thing happened in Norway when the Nazis took over that country. They utilized a collaborator by the name of Quisling to run Norway by Norwegians, but who were in bed with, so to speak, the occupying power. That was the case with the nation of Judea and the province of Galilee. They were being compromised by tax collectors and also by the religious establishment. Rome had a very heavy hand whenever they were threatened or sensed that there was some lack of loyalty. Rome was heavy in its taxation, paying for its massive empire by the funds taken from all of their captive provinces. Rome was clearly a pagan power, and many of the devout Jews hated the Romans and indeed longed for freedom and for liberation. Oh, there was so much talk in the air about the possibility that in their desperate times, the Messiah might appear. Now, in the Old Testament, the Messiah is described in many different forms. Imagine all of the different colored threads that make up a tapestry or a quilt, all being woven or stitched together. There were many different threads of prophecies about what the Messiah would be like, what he would do, who he would be. And some of them seemed, on first glance, to be mutually contradictory. There were certainly images of the Messiah being a great liberator and of being a king in the line of the great King David. But there were also many hints in the prophets that the Messiah's work would involve self-sacrifice, even a sacrificial lamb being slaughtered for the sake of the people. And there were other threads of the Messiah bringing about not a political, but a spiritual transformation that might change people from within. And in memorable phrases of one prophet, might write the law of God on people's hearts rather than just their minds. All of these, the people of the first century were seeking, but most were focusing, because of their political oppression, upon hoping for a political leader to come and bring about a great rebellion. The religious establishment of that time consisted of the professionals working in the temple in Jerusalem, the scribes and the priests, and the politicians who were collaborators with the Romans, who ran the religious Supreme Court, known as the Sanhedrin. And those were occupied by the two parties, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, you'll find in the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus is particularly hard on the Pharisees. Not so much for their theology, for they were tending to be orthodox in their understanding of the Old Testament, but rather in their lives and their practice. They were hypocrites. In fact, the word Pharisee has come to be a byword or synonym for a hypocrite. They were people who cared more about their power, their position, their glory, their wealth, and their esteem and status in the eyes of the people than they cared about those whom they were called to love in the name of God and shepherd and care for. And so Jesus is particularly tough on them. Now, let me tell you a little bit about what we'll find to be unique in the Gospel of Matthew. In Matthew, we find numerous opportunities to learn about and see how the Old Testament was completely fulfilled. In fact, we could say that Matthew is the most Jewish of the four Gospels, for you will encounter numerous quotes from the Old Testament and their confirmation and fulfillment. In addition to that, we find that Matthew will begin his book, very important to him, with laying out the genealogy to prove that Jesus is in fact the rightful heir to the throne of King David and is in direct line. Then we have one of the birth narratives as the Magi arrive from Persia to visit and bring gifts to the Christ child in Bethlehem, and then a hasty evacuation just before the king on the throne, Herod, very much in concert with the Romans, is attempting to snuff out any threat to his power. And then everything goes silent for about 30 years until the public ministry of Jesus begins. When he began his ministry, we find that he has one campaign slogan, let's call it, one clear message. His proclamation begins by announcing to the people as he traveled throughout Galilee and Judea this simple message: the kingdom of heaven is near. That's Matthew's preferred term. The other Gospels will often use the synonymous term kingdom of God, but kingdom of heaven is what Matthew prefers. And in using that term, he is emphasizing that this kingdom, with Jesus as its rightful king, is not a kingdom of this earth, but is a spiritual kingdom. It is a kingdom that you belong to, not because you live in a certain place or have your passport or citizenship in that country, but because you pledge your allegiance to the King and seek to be a faithful subject and follower obedient to him. Thus, the kingdom of heaven becomes the overarching theme of the Gospel of Matthew. And Matthew spends a lot of time giving us lengthy, detailed passages of Jesus' teaching. There are 5 notable ones. We first encounter in chapters 5 through 7 what we will call life in the kingdom. This is the section known collectively as the Sermon on the Mount. It was probably like Jesus' stump speech, one that he would repeat as he traveled around. Because there was no recording, people had to hear the words for themselves. And so Jesus would say over and over again, this is what it's going to mean if you become one of my subjects and live in my kingdom of the Spirit. Here's how life will be different. Then in chapter 10, he talks about leadership in the kingdom. Chapter 13, he will give us some parables of the kingdom. In chapter 18, we will learn about forgiveness and greatness in this kingdom that the new King Jesus is establishing. And finally, we get to chapters 24 and 25, where again, the action and the narrative is interrupted by an extended portion of teaching as Jesus talks about the culmination, the fulfillment of the kingdom. These will be the outline and the significant portions that we are going to find in Matthew. Well, it's going to be an exciting journey, and I am inviting you to join with me as we read through this book and as we discover who Jesus really was, the most amazing, remarkable, impactful man the world has ever seen, who has shaped the course of human history and culture more than anyone else. And we're going to learn about this man by not only reading the account of his life through one of his closest colleagues and eyewitnesses, but we are also going to be doing this reading keeping in mind the final verse of the book. Matthew punctuates his story with this amazing truth. Jesus said in his final words before he departed, "Surely I am with you always to the end of the age." Therefore, he is with us now. Imagine what it would be like to read a biography of, let's say, Abraham Lincoln or Winston Churchill, with the spirit of that great person right next to you, helping you to understand who he was. Well, that's the privilege we have, because Jesus is, in fact, as Matthew concludes his gospel by promising, with us always. We get to read the life of Jesus with his presence right beside us. God bless you as you undertake this exciting, thrilling adventure. Whether you've read the Gospel of Matthew before or not, you're going to see some new things. Your mind is going to be expanded. Your heart is going to be touched. You will discover who he is and what a difference he can make in your life. God bless you.